I was intrigued to talk with a young man who was adopted from Guatemala and raised in Wisconsin, USA. I wanted to explore his thoughts around identity and belonging, but I didn't yet understand how challenging his start to life had been. Jeremy shares how, as an infant, being raised in an orphanage, he was dropped on his head and suffered multiple skull fractures and a swelling of the brain. He talks about three babies sharing a single crib, and the remarkable detail that one of his crib mates was also adopted by a family in Wisconsin and actually lives about an hour away. From such dramatic beginnings, Jeremy was raised by deeply caring parents and has gone on to follow his passions and live a life shaped by curiosity, resilience, and meaningful experiences. Have a listen and hear more of Jeremy's story. Too many boys today feel lost, alone, and misunderstood. Too many parents feel the same. Behind today's troubling statistics is a generation of boys longing to be seen, heard, and valued. And yet the conversation around boys' emotional lives is still far too quiet. This new season of Unlocking the Parenting Code is here to change that. This season you'll hear more real conversations with young men, more expert voices on boys' mental health, more solo episodes where I share truths I've learned firsthand, and more wisdom from parents walking this road right now. It's time to open our eyes, open our hearts, and become the change our boys need. Boys aren't broken. They're waiting for us to truly see them, hear them, and stand with them. So tune in to Unlocking the Parenting Code for real conversations, real hope, and a new path forward for our boys. It's time. They're ready. Are we? Welcome back to Unlocking the Parenting Code, all about boys. I'm your host, Kathy, and today I'm joined by Jeremy Swick. Jeremy is an accomplished podcast host and producer, historian, curator, and archivist. Is that how you say it? Archivist? Archivist, with a passion for history, education, and social media. Born in Guatemala City and raised in Wisconsin, Jeremy is known on social media as the average historian, an average guy who loves playing rugby, discussing history, and constantly learning. He's driven to pursue his goals, which have led to extraordinary experiences. Jeremy has worked at several prestigious institutions, including the Pro Football Hall of Fame and the College Football Hall of Fame. He has extensive experience working in the digital space as a social media manager for various organizations. Most recently, he served as an archivist for the Wisconsin Black Historical Society, where he leveraged his skills to preserve and promote the rich history of Wisconsin's African American community. In 2025, he left the security of a 9-to-5 job and went all in on his business, Swick Media. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Jeremy, if someone were meeting you for the first time and really wanted to understand who you are and the values you live by, what would you want them to know?
I'd want them to know that more than anything, I think I'm a storyteller, whether that is in my actual job or really just talking to people, getting to know them, and just being someone who is kind of motivated by the idea of trusting the process. While things don't make sense always at the time, it's always working towards that goal, whatever that may be, whether it's in life or a career.
What would you say your core values are?
I'd say my core values would be treating people, I think, the way that I'd like to be treated, showing that respect and dignity, really, no matter who they are. I always struggle with the idea when, people decide, let's say you go to a networking event, when they look at that name, title, and tag and then decide if it's worth, in quotes, talking to someone. Rather, I'm someone who really just wants to get to know everyone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. I'd like to start off when I was kind of delving into who you are, and your story. It really started to make me think an awful lot about identity and connection and community and things like that. So I wonder if you would share a little bit about being born in Guatemala, being raised by Caucasian parents, and just what that story played out like for you.
So it's one of those things that I always talk when I talk about parents or my parents. I'm always referring to my parents who adopted me. But one of the things is, again, as we mentioned, being a bit of a storyteller. My journey starts a little bit, even I should say, quite a bit before I was born. In 1954, CIA and the United Fruit Company, which later became Chiquita, overthrew the government in Guatemala, which led to a 36-year civil war. I was born in year 31 of that 36 years civil war, and it really became foundational for I think who I became who I became, and honestly, I think one of the reasons that led me down the historical lens or the historical path, I should say. But one of those things growing up, it wasn't, and it was funny. I had a conversation with one of my friends at an event I was at. It was a conference I was doing the social media for this past weekend in Denver. I found out through just conversation that she was also adopted. And we had a great dialogue talking about that experience because obviously that experience is a little bit different for everyone. For me, from a very young age, it was known that I was adopted. There were those books that came out that talked about, a family that really loved their child, but also had to make a sacrifice to give that child a better life. And so my parents always ingrained in me on where I came from. So it wasn't a I always tell people it wasn't like I found out I was adopted. It was more so I already always knew. Of course, that led to some interesting, I think, events growing up, being a bit different than a predominantly white area, but also having white parents. It was one of those things where there were issues. Excuse me, there weren't issues. I should say there was experiences that a lot of times they didn't really have the answers for because their experiences on a day-to-day basis might have been wildly different than mine.
Do you know anything about your birth parents?
So I know on my birth certificate, my mother was 18 when she had me. I knew I had a brother who was 2 years older than me who I had never met. And then there was no father listed on the birth certificate.
And how old were you when you were adopted?
So I was 6 months when I was adopted.
And were you living with your birth mother until that time?
No, actually, I was in a orphanage in Guatemala City, and even through those experiences, they wildly shaped me. Of course, these cribs and orphanages were very much overcrowded. There was actually 3 kids to a crib in most of where I was. Interestingly enough, all 3 of us were actually adopted in Guatemala, or excuse me, all 3 of us were actually adopted in Wisconsin. And one of the people, Teresa, I call her my sister, we've known each other literally our whole lives, and we live about an hour away from each other. We don't get to see each other a ton, but thankfully for social media, we've always stayed in contact, throughout the years.
But it's quite amazing that you know that story.
It really is, and it's funny because my family's lawyer um, originally had adopted a child from Guatemala a few years before. My parents were looking to adopt as well, and through their conversation and friendship, they actually decided to go down together. And it was nice to have someone who'd already gone through the process to help my folks out a little bit more. That being said, my journey was a little bit unique in the sense, unfortunately, at the orphanage, a caretaker had dropped me on my head and cracked my skull in several places. I had a subdural hematoma, which was a swelling of the brain. My folks recall that they got a call from someone very upset from Guatemala speaking in Spanish. Of course, my parents did not speak Spanish, and so they got someone in our family my uncle, who spoke Spanish and was able to translate. And it was basically that an accident had happened. They don't know exactly what happened. And interestingly enough, it was almost like, okay, well, do you want someone else? Do you want another child? And of course, my folks were like, no, this is our kid. Like, that's not, it's not a return to sender or
Yeah.
anything like that. And so I think from a very young age, I knew how much my family cared about me.
So something that I kind of just digged into a little bit because I have a personal connection with it is, so when I was a baby, I was hospitalized for a period of time. And as an adult, like I would say within the last 10 years or so, I recognized some patterns in my behavior, in my character, that I could directly link back to that period of time. Even though I had a great childhood, I had, very loving parents, I've got a good story. But I definitely have characteristics of a person who has abandonment issues, and simply because of the environment. But being a baby, I hadn't connected. I didn't really put the two things together. Like, have you ever considered if there are things from your past that will impact how you behave and feel, in your adult life? Um, or is it not even part of your vision?
So I would say, in largely, it's not really part of my vision. That being said, I remember, of course, you get older, and I finally had stopped moving around so much. I lived several different states, pursuing my dreams in the history field. But it gets to a point where I'm definitely more local now. I recently bought a condo in Milwaukee, but my folks handed over a lot of those documents that it's just helpful to have. I mean, wouldn't say family history, should say my history. And I remember seeing this document years and years ago, but it was a doctor's report about my circumstances and kind of my outlook. And it pretty much said failure to thrive, failure to exist, baby can't lift head, and all these things I likely wouldn't be able to do in my life. And I don't know if I consciously thought about it growing up, but I think I wanted to be like the other kids so much that I maybe sometimes I would throw caution to the wind. I mean, I've been playing rugby the last 16 years, and knock on wood, I've been all right. But I think a lot of for me, it was not really being someone who allowed those limitations. Obviously, done with the best interest in my health, but those limitations put on me. So I do think, and I'm sure there are things that you look back on, and I think maybe the desire, especially as a young kid, to find that way to belong was definitely something that impacted me. But I think I was always happy and unique in the sense that I love sharing my story about coming from Guatemala. And of course, I was a little bit different than the other kids, but I think for me at least, it was always loving and being excited about sharing that story.
It's a beautiful way to perceive the story, is rather than in a negative light, or something lacking, something missing, more like a gift that your parents gave you as you were growing up.
I
Um,
appreciate you. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I said I appreciate you said that, and I always tell people when sharing my story is this wasn't overnight. This wasn't the idea that Rome was built in a day. This was a lot of time of reflecting and maybe seeing things in myself that I either didn't like or wanted to adjust, and kind of again doing that kind of unpacking and understanding a little bit more about maybe why I am feeling this way. Or I think for me it was trying to figure out why I was so curious about literally everything. I learned a lot of that information that I talked about the coup in 1954, as a pretty young child because I was obsessed with history. So I loved reading the history books, and you kind of want to learn a little bit more where you came from. And then when you turn, for example, to a page of like the history of Guatemala, especially coming out of the 90s, it talks about the rebuilding of the government, the rebuilding of the country, and I kept, I think, digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And it was interesting enough. In about 2001 and 2003, there were declassified CIA documents that basically confirmed what a lot of the history had been passed down. That, of course, yes, this was an actual a government interaction, and it was one of those things that for me, and it was interesting because I had to have been probably elementary and middle school, learning this kind of high level stuff. But I think for me, it helped me wrap my head around kind of why I was where I am today, if that makes sense.
Well, is that connected with, you mentioned something on your intake form, when it was something about boys, and boys asking, like, where do I fit in? And how, like, Did it happen that early for you that was that something conscious or unconscious? Like, where do I fit in? And that sparked everything connected with history, your history, the country's history.
I would attribute that largely to my parents because they wanted me to, of course, fit in with my friends, who honestly, growing up, it was predominantly white. That's just the neighborhood we lived in. But also the fact that I remember as a real young child, they would take me to these Guatemalan playgroups. And so, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a large amount of children adopted from Guatemala to the United States, I believe Israel, Egypt, and the United Kingdom, just through the influx of what was going on in the country. And so, interestingly enough, in our suburban area in Wisconsin, there was enough for a Guatemalan kind of get together play group. So I remember as a young kid, we learned kind of a little bit about the history. Obviously, a much watered down version, but the state, excuse me, the country flag, kind of the history. Of course, it was a little bit more fun and games, but from a real young age, I remember that. And the Milwaukee Public Museum on their third floor had a Guatemalan exhibit. And of course, it was a bit dated, and I remember it was a bit more of the rural village imagery. But for me, it gave me that little badge of honor when we'd have to go for a field trip. I would love sharing people. Oh, that's where I'm from. And so I think it was a bit of the trying to fit in, but also trying to understand who I was. And of course, you ask elementary school me, it probably wouldn't have been articulated that well. But I think it was always that curiosity of just wanting to learn more about my history. But I think just about anything I could get my hands on at that point.
Sounds like you had very special parents.
I would tend to agree. Yeah, I personally think they're the best, but I don't know if I can quite qualify that. But
Did you ever try to find your biological brother to see what his life turned out like?
no, I didn't. And it's funny you mention that because I think it's always one of those things that's let me correct myself. It was one of those things that's always been on my mind, but it's not like something you wake up and think about every day. It's not something that I would consider that is honestly super important to me at this point in my life. Of course, there's always the curiosity, and I'm in the process of, I think I'm going to order one of those DNA tests. And honestly, for me, it's a little bit more of the health
Yeah.
reasons. I recently had a check-in point with a new physician I'm seeing, and of course, my medical history starts with me coming to the United States. There's nothing really behind me in that sense, but no, there has been, for me at least, no huge interest in uh, exploring that area just yet.
Um, you used the phrase earned support, and you said you're connecting that a little bit with your father. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by earned support, parental support?
Yes, and so again, I'm thankful for my folks in the sense that they always supported me in a lot of what I'd done. But the thing is, of course, as a student going into, I should say, leaving high school, going into college, didn't have great grades. I don't think I was super serious about school. Again, as we go back a little bit, that challenging of what I could and couldn't do, or what I could and could not do. And I remember sitting down with my guidance counselor, and he had handed me the trade school papers, some of the local community college, and then the military flyers. I had desired to go to a 4 year school, and that was just kind of my trajectory. But he had, I would argue at this point, rightfully so, just saw that really wasn't looking too much in the cards for me based on how I had applied myself in school and just my appeared lack of interest in anything but social studies and gym class, for lack of better subjects. But it was one of those things that I think it motivated me towards the end of my high school years. And okay, I'm going to actually try. It's kind of one of those I'll show you. I ended up getting accepted to a 4 year school at the University of Wisconsin Eau Claire on academic probation. So I started my college career on academic probation, which tends to be a little backwards for the general way. But as we talked about, I remember in the intake form, was the fact that if I told my dad and my mom at that time that I was going to quit school or stop what I was doing and go all in on my own business. I think they would have rolled their eyes and been like, okay, that's probably a terrible idea. Really shouldn't do that. We've never seen any kind of leading towards that. It would pen, excuse me, it would have been like one of those kind of ideas out of thin air. Fast forward to when I finally left my job last year, my folks both looked at me and they're like, it's about time. We were kind of ready for you to do this. And I think it was one of those things that it was that earned support. Of course, they'd love me no matter what. They'd support me, but there would always been, I think, a question if I tried something like that in my younger years. By the time we got to where I was last year, it was one of those things. They had seen that kind of trajectory of success. It was those wins over the years and kind of, I always call them compound wins. It was getting, being successful in the museum field, being successful in launching a business, and it was just keep growing and growing. And so when I say earn support, that's really what I was talking about.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. Um, I was thinking about your dad, and what are three things that you wish he had have taught you?
Three things my dad he would have taught me. I joke now. I think one of the things on maybe a less serious note would have been how to be a little more handy. Uh, he still comes by. We FaceTime a lot when I'm working on things around the condo. And I know part of it was me. I just didn't really have that genuine interest in some of the woodworking or electricity, or excuse me, or electrical, or a lot of the things he had learned while throughout his times in the trades. So I would say that was one of the things that I would have loved to maybe asked a little more questions instead of just held the flashlight when I had to. I would say I think it's a good question. And it was one of those things where he did teach me later on, but maybe learning it earlier would have been the worst someone can say is no. I think for a long time I was afraid to ask for what I really wanted from whether it was jobs or people or school. And of course, you'll see in my background there's a lot of sports and memorabilia and things like that. And a little side story, my dad had met Aaron Rodgers, who was the Green Bay Packers quarterback for a number of years at an event. Of course, there's with kind of celebrities and athletes, it's a lot of times you can enter to win a prize package to get autographs or take pictures or do all that. Well, Mr. Rogers walked through the group at the work event and he was introducing to himself and talking to everyone. Well, my dad's a huge Packers fan in the professional football, and he's talking to the quarterback, and my dad asked him to sign his Harley Davidson motorcycle. And he had asked Aaron Rodgers if he had ever done that before, and Rodgers, of course, said no. My dad gave him a little bit of a hard time, and of course, he told him, of course, let me do this. I'll meet you after the event. We'll sign the motorcycle, and it will call it a day. Of course, my dad waited after it, and he's like, maybe he won't come. It'd be a cool story if he did. Of course, Mr. Rogers ends up coming around, signing it. They get a picture of him signing it. It's just a really good experience. But I remember my dad telling me about that. I think I was in college at the time. And he's like, yeah, the biggest thing is I realized the worst he could have said was no or no thank you. And I think after that moment, it was kind of like a light switch. I might as well just ask. Because again, the worst thing they're going to say is no or not answer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of people don't learn that till a lot later in life.
And
So
I
that's
would
two things.
go
Is
ahead.
there one more?
I would say the other thing, again, I it was something I learned from him, and I think a lot of times those with parents, your kids are always listening. It's whether we're applying what you're actually talking about. And one of his things from a pretty young age was me being on top of my finances, being financially responsible. And of course, a lot of times I'm sure he got met with eye rolls and kind of me, okay, yeah, sounds good. But there were little instances, okay, maybe I'll start an investing account. Maybe I'll learn little bit more. Maybe I will start that Roth IRA and kind of figure it out. But by the time I got out of college, it was one of those things where I'm very happy I had those lessons and I actually started applying them a little bit more than I probably some of my peers, but of course there's other peers that probably started that a lot earlier. But I think having that financial literacy and then which eventually became that financial responsibility was something I probably wish I would have listened more, frankly. I mean, he was talking about it all the time, but sometimes it's the kids deciding when to actually listen.
Right, right. Um, Jeremy, you said that you played rugby for more than 16 years, so that's almost half of your life, really. Um, what did being part of a team give you that you couldn't have gotten on your own?
So it's one of those things especially with rugby. I started playing in high school, and throughout high school I played football and done some other sports, and they were great. I enjoyed them, but I remember that first couple times of playing rugby. It was in the gymnasium. We're learning a little bit more about it's like the preseason. You're just kind of learning fundamentals and drills. But it was all my really good friends. We all decided to do it together, and I think it was one of those things that it continued to build the teamwork. I was kind of done with the high school sports because this was a club sport at the time, and I was kind of done with the high school sports, and I wanted something fun to do to stay active in the spring of my senior year. Ended up playing, and there was just something about it that I fell in love with. It actually is one of the bigger decisions of why I wanted to go to school at Eau Claire because I knew I could walk on the club team. Ended up playing there. But one of the things rugby taught me, especially in school, was the idea of balancing a schedule, making practice the priority. And of course, I had some. I was fortunate in the sense that I had some scholarship money, and I had a job, but it was one of those campus jobs that doesn't really count as a job. They gave you money basically. It was some pretty easy things like that, but at the same time, it was creating that schedule, making sure my classes were around rugby practice, and so I would have to make sure I would get my schoolwork done before I go to training, so I could be done with it after, not have to worry about that. And I think for me, it was the first time I'd really put that responsibility on myself. As I had mentioned, I wasn't a great student in high school. I just kind of enjoyed being with my friends and playing sports. I knew once they put me on academic probation to start college that I kind of needed to buckle down and really give it a shot. I didn't want them to all those ideas that they had, excuse me, like the school had about me to be true. And so it was one of those things that really I think gave me direction and guidance. Even though sometimes, especially back then, rugby was mislabeled a little bit more by hooligans than it was by the professional students, if you will. But one of the great things it did, it taught me that teamwork, that camaraderie, and I didn't truly realize it until I left college and I was playing in men's leagues. And I have to laugh, when I was applying for museum positions, there were two basic requirements I needed. Excuse me, three. One, it needed to be full time, so I wasn't working part time, especially if I was planning on moving really anywhere in the country. The second one, it just needed to be near a city because I'm not so much of a rural person. I do like being around in a city. And third, and I'd argue maybe the most important thing was there had to be a rugby team within a reasonable driving distance. Because I knew if I was going to pack up and move literally anywhere at that point in the country, that I wanted to be able to play rugby. And it's done such wonders for me socially, literally literally every aspect of my life. I knew when I was moving around these different places, I could go join a rugby club, and it would be a great experience to meet people in the area, create those friends, and one of those things that I really attribute rugby to, especially as an adult. I don't think enough men or women get that opportunity to go out and meet friends because I couldn't even imagine being in my mid 30s and moving to a new city and then trying to figure out how you're going to go make friends without it feeling awkward or weird. I just remember when I showed up in Atlanta, I joined the rugby club, and within, I think we're going out for pints the next night. And so that's one of those great things about rugby and that kind of welcoming spirit.
Well, there's so much talk these days about men's mental health, the high suicide rates, the boy crisis, the loneliness epidemic, all of those things. My guess is that being, in a team like that would be a bit of a buffer to some of those situations that don't play out well as far as being mentally healthy.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's one of those things that, of course, with the kind of the masculine identity, it's a lot of, oh yeah, we don't talk about that. But it's so funny because with, especially once you get to know, at least in my cases with the rugby clubs I've been on, of course they're all. I'll be honest. There's always probably that little bit of guard when you're first meeting people. You don't want to talk about the fact that you're having a bad day, or something's going on. But I think the more and more, at least with rugby, I think we have to be so close, literally physically playing the sport we play. But also a lot of it is trusting your guys, and so it's being more comfortable when you're having a bad day, or yo, I broke up with such and such, and I'd love to just go hang out with the guys tonight. And of course, making that happen, I think is one of those really cool things about the sport of rugby, especially. I know a lot of friends that play on like rec and intramural teams and soccer teams and kickball teams, which I think is great. But you kind of go home and do your own thing after. That's Tuesday nights, or a Wednesday night, or whatever night it may be. With rugby, it's usually practice 2 to 3 times a week. We have games on Saturdays, and 9 times out of 10 during the season, you're seeing these guys 3 or 4 times a week in a lot of cases, and I think that alone builds that sense of trust and camaraderie.
I was just thinking when you were talking because rugby is one of those sports that like it is so masculine. Like um it's just one of those sports. And it makes me wonder, since you are playing a sport where you're allowed to, like it's acceptable to express all of those really strong, intense, masculine emotions. I wonder if that allows you with the same people the trust to be vulnerable in your emotional world. When I was raising my son, I longed for a guide, something real, honest, and grounded in what boys truly need. So I created the book that I wish I'd had. Packed with tools and real world strategies that actually work, you'll learn how to nurture his emotional world and finally understand the feelings behind his behavior. Because boys don't need punishment, they need guidance. We'll bust the myths that keep boys boxed in and help you support him through the real challenges of growing up. Most of all, it's about transforming your connection, one small moment at a time. Raising boys who become remarkable men. Get your copy today, and let's create a beautiful future together.
I think that's an interesting point, and I think definitely to an extent it definitely is. With it, as you mentioned, being such a physical and at times violent game, I think for me at least, I really want to trust the people I'm playing with. And it's not just so we win, it's so I stay safe when you're going into those big scrums. If I don't trust the guy behind me, then maybe I'm not thinking about what I'm supposed to be doing. And I think a lot of times injuries happen on teams that don't trust each other as much. Of course, it's rugby, and there are those incidences where things literally just do happen. But I think it is that inherent balance of trust in the sport we play that we want to have people that have our backs, whether it's on the pitch or off.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so when you think about young men in society today, where do you think they feel the most disconnect? Is it with purpose, community, or self-worth?
I think for a larger amount of people, it is that community aspect. I think, and one of the great things I always tell people is those that play video games. I think that is a very much viable place to make friends and have those be genuine friendships. It's funny, we were actually, me and a couple of friends were actually at a wedding a couple years ago about a guy we met playing online video games with. He invited a bunch of them down to Georgia, of all places, where I was living at the time. And a lot of them, it was the first time they had ever actually met in person. Of course, there were FaceTimes and all that, and years of playing video games together. But I think it is that place of community where you can find connection. But I don't think, in a large scale, enough people do that because, of course, in my case, it heavily was driven towards rugby, and I know that's a little bit of a biased lens for me, but I do see people struggle with that fact that maybe they stop playing a sport or having some kind of extracurricular activity. It doesn't necessarily need to be sports, but a lot of times post college that doesn't exist, or in many cases even post high school. You join the workforce, you go to work, maybe go to those happy hours once a month, and it's kind of that cliche, you're there for an hour or two and that's kind of the end of your time. So I think a lot of that idea of community is lacking for a lot of people.
I agree completely. If you were thinking about again young men, what do you think it is about life that confuses so many young men?
I think a lot of it's the uncertainty that we see in the world today, and not just in the political aspect, but I think just how quickly things are changing. You're being told to go to school for something, and then, especially now, within months, AI's, I wouldn't say replacing it, but it's definitely challenging those norms. I think for a long time the idea was you enter a trade, you get a good paying job, your life is good. You enter school, you get a well paying job, life is good. And I think a lot of that narrative has been flipped on its head in the sense of just what businesses and companies and organizations are requiring or looking at. And I think there's just a lot of confusion where a lot of people don't really know to go. They followed this path, they colored inside the lines, they did everything they were supposed to, and things for a lot of people still aren't working out.
So where would you say they feel the most pressure to perform rather than like acting or reacting honestly? Where is that pressure?
I think a lot of that pressure is what people perceive as success. And I honestly don't leave that just to social media. But I think one of the things is the pressure is so different for so many different people. Some people, maybe it is social media. They see those guys flexing with the girls and the money and, living that great lifestyle. But then on the same token, maybe it's more immediate with your family that if you're single, your parents, your aunts at Christmas are wondering, oh, when are you getting married? When are you bringing someone to Christmas? Or when are you having kids? And so I think a lot of times that pressure comes from so many different areas if you let it. And I don't think there's a specific point for everyone, but I think it's just different for everyone, if that makes sense.
It does. So when, either when you were younger or currently, what's helped you when you've been struggling?
That's a great question. What helps me when I'm struggling? For me, and I know for a fact it's not always the healthiest. Excuse me, it's not always the healthiest way. But when I start to kind of feel those pressures, I find something I can really hone in on, work on. I think a lot of times for me in the last few years, it's been the business. When I'm, sometimes was struggling in the museum field to make ends meet. I'm like, okay, well, if I can get another client on the side that takes the pressure off of me having to buy groceries this month. And so a lot of times for me, it was kind of diving deeper into whatever I was working on at the time. And I think that helped me, of course, grow my business, but also I think for me, sometimes it was just keeping that mind busy, not being able to even dwell on some setbacks that have happened or things that they didn't go the way I anticipated. So a lot of times for me, it was kind of just sticking my nose to the grindstone and continue to work on whatever I had going on at that exact moment.
You've never had depression or anxiety like override that reaction and you had to work hard to get back to that space where you could actually carry that out?
So for me, I think in between undergrad and grad school, I planned to go into education and really decided to pivot towards the museum field. And I was fortunate, I actually ended up earning my master's at Eau Claire. And it was one of those things where you could feel that rock bottom. I could feel that rock bottom moment, not really knowing what to do. And it was one of those things where I just kind of sat back and realized that I don't think I have any other choice. Like, I really need to, if I decide to go to grad school, I really need to put all in on this. I really need to work hard to get not just the grades, but get the experiences, get the connections to really keep going, kind of find what was next. I was fortunate. I ended up going as an intern to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio during grad school. And I had a few amazing internships after that, but I had another moment like that. My internship had ended at the historic photography studio I worked at. I had loved every second of it. They were fortunate enough I was only supposed to be there 3 months, and they ended up keeping me an additional 3 months. The problem was the funding was every week, so I didn't really know if I was going to have a job from week to week. And that, of course, built pressure to keep looking for jobs, but also kind of keep an idea of what I'm trying to do. And of course, that internship unfortunately eventually ended. I moved back home. I was actually working second shift, cleaning bathrooms at schools of all places after being in the education field. And I was driving home at like 2 in the morning, honestly crying because I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm taking every next step that I'm supposed to, and I really have no idea what to do, what's next. And the next week, I get a call that I get invited for a job up in Minnesota. Again, it was the middle of nowhere, but I could live in the cities, and I actually ended up living with some rugby teammates from college. But even there, I knew it wasn't my dream job by any sense of the imagination. But for me, it was always doing that next step, that next best step. It wasn't always the right step, but it was the next best step. And I think for me, a lot of that was able to honestly mask some of the feelings I was feeling. And I think fortunately for me, by the time I was able to take a step back and kind of breathe, years had passed, but I had felt good about where I was at, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I would imagine at at a time in life like that, that once again your parents would have been um, a strong pillar for you to lean on.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, they saw at that point, again, we were talking about that kind of earned success. It wasn't like I was sitting at home playing video games while all this was happening. I was moving from city to city. I drove down, lived in Akron, Ohio for about 4 months, and I literally drove down with my car, my TV. I was able to fit my TV in my back seat with my video game system, and I had found a roommate on Craigslist, and it worked. It was a great experience actually, but it was one of those things where I just kept doing the next best thing, even though it might not have been the thing I wanted to do. I mean, of course, I wanted that internship experience, but a lot of the things it was okay. Well, this is the next step I need to take for this, or I can see if I do this, then this success will follow or will likely follow. So, for me, I think for them it was a lot of that support of just keep going, or if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Mm. Jeremy, if there was one question that adults could ask a young man more often, one that really invited honesty, and if it was the right moment, could actually change that young man's path in life, what would the question be, and why would it matter so much?
I think a lot of it is for parents to understand what their kids are actually interested in. And I say that because a lot of times I think so many people make those career decisions, whether it's going to college or entering the trades or joining the military. And those I think are all viable answers. But I think a lot of it is asking your kids what they really are interested in, and trying to just help them figure out the way to see that success. I have far too many people my age that I see. I'm 34, that like hate what they do. They hate their jobs. They hate waking up and going to work 40 hours, 50 hours, 60 hours a week. And for me, I couldn't imagine that. I've been fortunate. I kind of joke that I've been very heavily fun based most of my career, by basically just doing things I've enjoyed. And of course, even when I left the museum field, it probably took me a couple years longer because I enjoyed it so much that, of course, I was basically working two full time jobs at the point. But I really did enjoy what I was doing. So I think so much of it is trying to figure out what kids really do enjoy, because I think so many of us go down that path that we do what we think we're supposed to do. We color in the lines, and then, it's 15, 10 years down the line, and you're miserable. You can't figure out where you went wrong, and the problem is you didn't go wrong anywhere. You just kept going down the path you thought you were supposed to be on.
Yeah, I agree. I think from a very, very young age, maybe all children, but my focus is on boys. And I think the educational system sometimes hampers boys being able to thrive in the system. But even at the youngest of ages, if a parent can follow the passion and the interest of their son or their child, it often goes much further than you could possibly imagine. And it's that whole thing of looking at your child and thinking, well, they are competent, they're capable, I can follow their lead. And that seems to make quite a big difference in how children feel about their own agency and taking control and when you're interested in something, like the learning is just natural. Like it's not forced. So I agree.
Correct. Yeah, I also have to laugh because I talk about this with my folks a lot. And growing up, we had one of those library reading programs where if you read X amount of hours or pages or whatever it may be in the summer, then you got the certain prizes. And of course, just being a kid, I dreaded it because it didn't sound that fun. I did like reading, but it kind of felt forced then. But my folks made me do it, and they made me do it honestly. But the caveat was I could pick whatever book I wanted. Like I could pick whatever genre as long as it wasn't me actively like being in third, fourth grade grabbing a picture book. But other than that, within reason, they were very okay with it. And I remember I gravitated heavily towards sports biographies and autobiographies and kind of anything sports history or I mean, I started I think getting interested in history at that point too, but it's so funny because I always give my dad a hard time. There was one of those books with every fact you needed to know about football or college football at the
Yeah.
time. And I remember him making a joke, okay, we can't wait to see you use that in your career. And of course, I became the College Football Hall of Fame historian and curator. So I still have that book, and I still give him a hard time every once in a while because I'm like, hey, remember that book that you were giving me a hard time about? That how would I ever use that in my real life? And of course, it ended up working out. But I think it was one of those things where I got to pick what I wanted to do, and again, we mentioned a little bit of that agency. I was devouring those books. It was, I mean, you couldn't keep them out of my hands, and I got to learn more about my favorite players. And of course, it wasn't just the children's versions of those books. It was the adult or the regular books. So of course, I think you learn a little bit more than you anticipate sometimes as a kid. And of course, you don't understand everything, but I think it gave me a good variety of learning more about my favorite players, but also I think humanizing them at the same time.
Yeah, our son did the same kind of thing with baseball, and it was just could not get enough of it. And so our job, I figured, was to create the environment just to get, good quality information, books, stats, everything he needed to dig into it and support that kind of learning. And it surpassed anything any teacher would have thought up. So, Jeremy, before we finish today, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wish we had of?
I think the biggest thing for me with parents is understanding that they're not going to get everything perfect. No one does. And as a child now who's done a lot of growing, and of course, I think it's been great to see my parents on a level that is much more human in the sense of like being an adult. And I know not everyone is fortunate enough to have great parents in their life, or even as life progresses, people pass away, and that's obviously a reality as well. But for me, it's been so cool over the last few years to kind of see my parents. Of course, they're still my parents, but at the end of the day, but kind of seeing how their life experiences have really shaped how they parented you, or if you dig back into the history, how their grandparents parented them. And so I think it's one of those things that, for me at least, been really interesting to learn more a bit about my parents and just knowing that they've always done what they think is best. Of course, it's never perfect, but I think it's a noble job that they did, and I'm always appreciative of that.
Well, I do think it's the most important, and you can't go wrong by putting everything you've got into it, even if you make mistakes along the way. So I agree. Listen, where can people, I know that you've started up a new business, and Where can people connect with you or find out more about your work or
Yeah, absolutely. And so we actually launched in 2018. It's Swick Media. You can find us at swickmedia.com. You can find me online at The Average Historian on pretty much every social media platform. If you Google Jeremy Swick, I'm usually the top one or two pages that come up, thankfully. But it was one of those things where I saw a gap in, honestly, museums, but a lot of times they had social media, but it wasn't done super well, or they outsourced it to a big company that doesn't know anything about history. They just basically would post the hours of when this business was open. And for me, there was just so much more to museums that could be done, from behind the scenes to just talking about the interesting history facts that are going on in that place. And so one of the things I had done in 2018 is started doing work on the side with some obscure businesses, and eventually turned into working with the marketing team at the College Football Hall of Fame, and kind of helping them create those behind the scenes visions of what I think a museum social media could be. And of course, a lot of museums have done great work. But as we fast forwarded to last year when I left the job, my main clients had actually become podcasters, those looking to launch their own podcasts, and I eventually had launched my own as well. But it was the idea that everyone has a story to tell, and one of the things I love working with Swick Media is the fact that we help those storytellers tell their stories, where they've never picked up a mic before, or they just feel like they have interesting people to talk to. One of our biggest things is just launching podcasts, but you can find us at swickmedia.com.
I didn't realize all that. Very interesting. I know how precious time is, and I do hope that you feel that I honored yours today. And it really has been a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm sure that your story will inspire, especially parents listening to this. So thank you very much, Jeremy.
Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us on Unlocking the Parenting Code, all about boys. Be sure to check out Jeremy's links in the show notes, and don't forget to subscribe, share, and tune in next week for more conversations about boys and men. Thank you for sharing your time with me today. Every conversation we have here is a step toward raising boys who feel seen, heard, and deeply valued. If you're looking for more support on this journey, I invite you to visit me at sonhoodcoaching.com. You'll find a link in the show notes. And as always, thank you for being part of this important movement. Until next time, take good care.